Good afternoon, and welcome to Making Sense of the Turmoil in China. My name is Stephen. The acoustics here are a little bit rough. My name is Stephen Gregory, and I am the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of the English language editions of the Epoch Times. Before going further, I would like to express our thanks to Congressman Dana Rohrabacher for sponsoring our use of this room, and to Paul Berkowitz, Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigations, and Scott Coulinan, Staff Associate for the Subcommittee, for their help in making arrangements for this room. On February 6th, the former police chief of the central western city of Chongqing in China, Wang Lijun, fled to the U.S. consulate in Chengdu. In doing so, he set in motion a series of events that promise to fundamentally change China. We have seen Wang and his former boss, Bo Xilai, purged, and Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao assert themselves as they never have before. As power shifts within the party, there are indications that everything is on the table. What role the party should play in China is up for serious discussion. The redress of the Tiananmen Square massacre is being considered, as too is the redress of the persecution of Falun Gong. This is a moment ripe with possibility, but in order to respond constructively to the events in China, one first needs to understand what's happening. The Epoch Times has organized this panel to help with this urgent task. In the next hour, we'll hear from our four speakers, and then we'll have questions and discussion. I understand many of you have crowded and busy schedules today. I understand there's a recess coming in a little over a week, and so if business calls, please feel free to leave at any time in the proceedings. Our first speaker is the Honorable David Kilgore. We unfortunately live in a time of deep disappointment with politicians and politics in general. But there are examples among us of individuals whose principled actions can redeem politics and public life for us if we take notice of them. David Kilgore is such an example. David served 7 terms in the Canadian Parliament, and at various points in his parliamentary career was Deputy Speaker, Chair of the Committees of the whole House, Secretary of State for Latin America and Africa, Secretary of State for the Asia-Pacific region. In 2006, he chose not to stand for re-election, and I suspect he did so because there was so much that he could do outside of Parliament. He is co-chair of the Canadian Friends of a Democratic Iran, a director of the Washington-based Council for a Community of Democracies, and director of the New York-based NGO Advancing Human Rights. He is also the author, with David T. Jones, Uneasy Neighbors, a book dedicated to making our relations with our neighbors to the north a little bit better, and another book of a different sort with David Mattis, Bloody Harvest, the killing of Falun Gong for their organs. He and Mattis were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010. I give you David Kilgore.
Thank you, Chairman. Please forgive us for being 4 men up here. In Canada, I was joking, you cannot have a panel with 4 men. It has to be either 2 and 2. Ideally, it should be 2 and 2. And the good news, and I know time is short, is that my text, I think, is outside, and I'll just try to give what parts of it to save time. There's so many people who have a lot to say here. Let me start. Democratic governments and their legislators should all be as actively engaged with China's people and party state as feasible during the transitional period that is underway now. Let me illustrate, and you've already mentioned this problem that we're facing, if you like, with Bo Xilai, whom many democratic governments and business people courted even after it was very clear that he was on his way out. My own prime minister for example, met with him in Chongqing on February the 11th, 9 days after his former police chief, Wang Lijun, had sought refuge in your consulate in Chengdu. As I hope most of you know, Bo and Wang had earlier been especially brutal persecutors of Falun Gong. Premier Wen Jiabao was so troubled by Wang's conduct, oh yes, that's probably a good idea, thank you, that at his rhetorical question to party members appears to have been leaked from a closed meeting on March the 14th, quote, this is really shuddering. Without anesthetic, the live harvesting of human organs and selling them for money, is this something that a human could do? Close quote, asked the Premier of China. Wang also used the many lawsuits launched against Bo in 13 countries for his role in organ pillaging to have him removed as Commerce Secretary in 2007. And I ask, why were all democratic governments not supporting Wen on political reform, Wen and other like-minded party members then, and how many of them are doing it now? Let me be clear on this. Bo, Wang, Zhou, Yong Kong, who's the head of the Political and Legislative Committee, and others were members of the Jiang Zemin leadership faction. They rose in the party after 99 because they supported Jiang's persecution of Falun Gong after 99. Yet only the recent State Department country reports, I believe that came out on May the 24th, acknowledged for the first time, ladies and gentlemen, to the best of my knowledge, that after 7 years, that organ pillaging of Falun Gong is occurring. They didn't even acknowledge it themselves. They said there are reports that Falun Gong organs are being pillaged. So one hopes that the U.S. and other governments will support political reform in China more vigorously in the future. And I know that some of the congressmen have done an excellent job in this, and I salute them. I think you all know who they are. A couple of other topics I'd like to mention. For example, is political Maoism ending? The methods of Mao did not perish when he did in 1976. The party still uses overwhelming force to suppress voices advocating dignity for all and the rule of law. One, of course, is Gao Zhisheng, a thrice Nobel Prize nominated lawyer. A decade ago, as I'm sure many of you know, he was named one of China's top lawyers. The party wrath was released, though, when he decided to defend Falun Gong. He began with removal of his permit to practice law, an attempt on his life, a police attack on his family, and the cessation of his income. It intensified when he responded in the nonviolent tradition of Gandhi by launching a nationwide hunger strike calling for equal dignity for all. One of his communiques described more than 50 days of torture in prison. I must say something about the Tibet and the Dalai Lama. Another example of ongoing Gao misgovernance is Tibet and the Dalai Lama. He's the spiritual leader of Tibetans. He's an honorary citizen of Canada and a respected world leader. His Holiness is Beijing's best hope for a peaceful resolution of the Tibet issue. Advocating Tibetan autonomy under Chinese rule, he disavows violence, does not favor secession, and has this year turned over the political role to democratically elected men and women. He spoke recently, or a couple of months ago, to a large audience in Ottawa. He indicated that he felt the Chinese people generally would accept a degree of autonomy for Tibet if aware that this is all that is being sought. He also mentioned, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the loss of almost 30 Tibetan lives to self-immolation. That simply has to stop. Religious persecution, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. Just let me say this, that today all faiths have to adapt their religious practices to suit the party's political objectives. Consequently, there are sham ordinations of bishops without a papal mandate. The Protestants are tightly regulated to the point that millions of them have fled to illegal house churches. And of course, freedom of belief is essential to any open society. Word about the natural environment. 3 decades of anything goes economics have done major harm to the people of China, their natural environment, their neighbors, and the world as a whole. Consider, 500 million Chinese citizens now lack access to safe drinking water, yet many factories continue to dump waste into surface water with impunity. Coal now provides about 2/3 of China's energy, and it already burns more of it than Europe, Japan, and the US combined. Many experts conclude that China cannot go green without political change. Yes, Ponzi capitalism. Jonathan Manthorpe, a respected journalist in Canada and a long observer of China, concluded last year, the Vancouver Sun, this, quote, "What one is seeing in China is variations of what can only be called a Ponzi scheme. A local government without a functioning system for raising tax revenue and riddled with corruption sells development land to garner cash, first getting rid of the farmers living on the land. The land will then be sold to a development company owned by the local government. The municipality has the power to instruct banks to lend the development company the money for the sale. So the local government gets its cash, the municipally owned company gets to build a speculative residential or industrial complex, and all seems well," close quote. I spotted a related item on this in the Financial Times not long ago. Listen to this. In the coastal city of Wenzhou, luxury apartments are to be built for as much as 70,000 yuan, it's about $11,000, a square meter, which is about twice the annual income of the average resident. To finance a 150 square meter apartment in the building would consume every penny of a typical resident's income for 350 years. A way forward. Our values, American, Canadian, European, Asian, all universal values must be asserted continuously in dealings with Beijing. There were 180,000 mass incidents in China in 2010, everything from strikes to riots and demonstrations, twice as many as 2006. The regime continues to rely on repression and brutality to maintain itself in office. An interesting post-Taiwan election piece appeared in the New York Times. It noted that the Chinese party state news agency Xinhua, and perhaps they're here today, avoided the words president and democracy, presenting the election as a merely local one. A businessman from China who had observed the election, however, added, quote, "This is an amazing idea to be able to choose the people who represent you. I think democracy will come to China. It's only a matter of time," he said. A democratic China would not be killing Falun Gong citizens in forced labor camps. That it continues to happen is a key indicator of acute misgovernance. So in conclusion, governments of open societies and their private sector should examine why they are supporting the violation of so many universal values in order to increase trade and business with China. For years, as you all know, this has resulted mostly in our jobs being outsourced to China and continuous increases in our bilateral trade deficits. Do those in our business communities so overinvested in China feel no responsibility to the employment needs of Americans and Canadians? Are the rest of us too focused on access to inexpensive consumer goods and essentially ignoring the human, social, and natural environment costs paid by the Chinese people to produce them? Peter Navarro, a professor at the University of California, asserts that the consumer markets worldwide have been conquered by China largely through cheating. For its trading partners, Navarro has various proposals intended to ensure that trading becomes fair for once. Specifically, he says that all trading nations should, I'll just give a couple, define currency manipulation as an export subsidy and add it to other subsidies when calculating anti-dumping and countervail penalties. Ban the use of forced labor effectively, not just on paper, and you probably know your government in America has an agreement on this, which is simply observed in the breach rather than enforced, and provide decent wages and working conditions for all. Apply provisions for protection of the natural environment for all trade agreements. So finally, the party state in Beijing is making major changes in its senior personnel. Those appointed should seek dignity for all Chinese if they wish to achieve sustainable prosperity at home. The current party state roles in places like Syria, Burma, Iran, Nepal, North Korea, Sudan, Taiwan, Zimbabwe, and elsewhere will also require significant change if a new government's goal is to build international harmony with justice for all nations. The people of China, ladies and gentlemen, want the same things as the rest of us: education, safety and security, good jobs, the rule of law, democratic governance, and a sustainable natural environment. If the party state ends its violations of human dignity at home and abroad and begins to treat all members of the human family in an equitable way, the new century can bring harmony for China and the world. Thank you.
Thank you, David. If China's virtuoso pianist, Long Long, had known that our next speaker, Matthew Robertson, was on the China beat here in Washington, D.C., I imagine that on his visit to the White House last year, he might have played the Moonlight Sonata or a Chopin etude or Chopsticks, anything other than the tune he did play, My Motherland. In a series of reports, Matthew showed how this song contained within it a very well-known anti-American propaganda tune, how Long Long and the entire Chinese delegation had to know of the import of this song, and how the playing of it had been planned well in advance. His articles on Long Long and his performance at the White House went viral, as Americans were indignant at what many described as a slap in the face of the United States. This episode put on display for readers of Drudge and followers of talk radio and news programs around the world the qualities in Matthew that we at the Epoch Times have almost come to take for granted: original, rigorous reporting, and a keen eye for what is really significant in an event that others might overlook. Today, Matthew will speak on the key to understanding China's political crisis. Matthew.
Thank you. If you're a regular reader of our newspaper, you'll know that our columnists have accurately foretold the dramatic events that have unfolded recently in China. There's an underlying issue that our journalists understand, which allows us to see the current situation with clarity. It explains the sudden and dramatic fall of Bo Xilai. It even provides insights into how and why Google was forced out of China. I'm going to make what may sound like a bold assertion, that Falun Gong and the persecution of Falun Gong is the core issue behind the extraordinary political events we see unfolding in China today. Our failure to understand Falun Gong's impact and consider it in our relations with China wouldn't just mean putting human rights on the back burner. It would mean engaging with China with our eyes closed. First, at risk of being seen to downplay the importance of other very serious human rights concerns inside China, I will stress that my co-panelist, Yang Xia, will describe how the repressive apparatus developed over the 13 years of persecuting Falun Gong practitioners has been used more recently to target human rights defenders of all types. There are 4 points in this discussion. The first is that there is a faction in the CCP that has been seeking to overturn settled arrangements in the Communist Party and seize power. We first learned about this in February. Wang Lijun was the chief of police for Bo Xilai, who ruled the giant city of Chongqing in central western China. Wang fled to the American consulate in Chengdu, spent several hours away by car. He'd been under investigation by Party Central. Bo apparently feared that Wang would crack and turned on him. Wang was fleeing for his life. It wasn't simply to share evidence implicating his boss's wife in murder, because given Wang Lijun's role in large-scale organ harvesting, it would be highly unlikely that he would suddenly grow a conscience and want to stand up to Bo Xilai over the death of Neil Haywood. Bill Gertz, a national US security reporter, soon reported that Wang Lijun had revealed to the US officials that Bo Xilai and Zhou Yongkang were plotting to thwart the ascension to power of Xi Jinping, who should assume the leadership of the CCP later this year or early next year if the party congress is delayed. The alliance between Bo and Zhou was well known. Zhou Yongkang is the domestic security Tsar in the Communist Party, and he has publicly pushed for Bo Xilai to be named to the Standing Committee, which is the group of 9 men who rule the Communist Party, and for Bo Xilai to take Zhou's place in running law enforcement in the country. Wang revealed there was more to this alliance than meets the eye. After Xi assumed office, Bo and Zhou Yongkang planned on pushing Xi aside and promoting Bo Xilai to the top. The Epoch Times had its own Chinese sources that affirmed what Gertz had reported, and so did a number of dissident Chinese language media who have accurately reported the unfolding events in this political drama. Further corroboration emerged in a story the Epoch Times broke about why Google was forced out of China. Bo and Zhou Yongkang wanted to manipulate internet searches so that information embarrassing to Xi Jinping, as well as Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao, would appear in searches. They would use the internet to weaken them. In order to control internet searches, they made a deal with Baidu, Google's primary China-based search competitor at the time, to force Google out. And Baidu would collect Google's market share, and then Baidu would tailor internet searches to suit Bo and Zhou's agenda. Zhou and Bo succeeded in pushing Google out, and Baidu's search results for Xi Jinping, Hu Jintao, and Wen Jiabao, written in Pinyin, began returning articles with titles like Hu Jintao's son terribly corrupt, Jiang Zemin wants to get to the bottom of it, and Xi Jinping is a lecher, plays with women in Zhejiang behind his second wife, and so forth. To sum it up, Bo and Zhou Yongkang sought to seize power through extraordinary means. The media have often reported infighting in China. This word is misleading. It's not parliamentary maneuvering. It is deadly serious, and before this is over, we may see executions. My second point, the decision to persecute Falun Gong forced Jiang Zemin to build an alternative power structure inside the Communist Party. In 1999, Jiang Zemin began the persecution against Falun Gong. It was a divisive, controversial thing to have done. In the end, it completely backfired and has turned into a nightmare for the party. It's worth looking back to something written at the time. In November of 1999, John Pomfret of the Washington Post wrote, "The campaign has revealed dissent at the top echelons of power, undermining the image of China's leadership as united and pragmatic. Communist Party sources said that the Standing Committee of the Politburo did not unanimously endorse the crackdown, and that President Jiang Zemin alone decided that Falun Gong must be eliminated. Consider the enormity of what Jiang decided on his own to do. Between 70 and 100 million people were practicing Falun Gong in China in 1999. Each of those individuals has family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues. Jiang in effect set the Communist Party at war against a huge fraction of the Chinese people. Jiang thought his campaign would be over in 3 months. When he found that wasn't the case, he had to improvise. Because the campaign was not popular, he was recruiting officials with bribery, blackmail, and coercion. He needed to create a faction that had direct personal ties with him. Jiang had to ensure that the persecution would continue, otherwise he would have reason to fear his legacy, his freedom, and in the end even his life. Once the party stopped the persecution, that huge part of the population that had been damaged would demand an accounting. And so in 2002, when Jiang was scheduled to retire as head of the CCP, he expanded the Standing Committee and put 2 of his people, Luo Gan and Li Changchun, on it. In addition, he had the Standing Committee change one of their rules, which changing it from obey the General Secretary to work by consensus. This was a means of allowing Jiang to keep his people still dominating the committee, and it meant that he never really relinquished power. In addition to these steps, he built up the Political and Legislative Affairs Committee, or the PLAC, into a second center of power within the party. The PLAC controls every aspect of law enforcement in China, from police to judges to lawyers to labor camps to surveillance. Its People's Armed Police numbers 1.5 million, the size of an army. Jiang assured that all the means of coercion outside the military were at the command of his allies, giving Jiang and his faction a kind of independence from the Communist Party itself. It's worth pausing to reflect at the sheer cost of an apparatus capable of repressing this number of people. This is a topic that my co-panelist Yang Xia will delve into. The third point, the crimes committed in persecuting Falun Gong were once acknowledged threaten the existence of the Communist Party. Bo Xilai has been sued in over a dozen countries for crimes against humanity and genocide. He was indicted by the Spanish National Court in 2009 on charges of genocide and torture. The best guess is that tens of thousands of practitioners have died from torture and abuse. An estimated 450,000 to 1 million are locked up in labor camps right now, where they suffer abuse, brainwashing, and torture. And throughout China, families have been shattered. There is an entire generation of orphans who have lost one or both parents to the persecution. As horrible as all this is, there's something far worse: the evil of forced live organ harvesting going on in China. The best estimates indicate that tens of thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have been killed for their organs while still alive, because the organs deteriorate after brain death. This has been organized by the PLAC, and leading members of Jiang's faction are heavily involved. Wang Lijun has bragged in an award speech of overseeing thousands of organ harvesting operations. Shenyang City and Liaoning Province under Bo Xilai appears to have been ground zero for the development of this atrocity. Zhou Yongkang, according to evidence, has also been involved and fully cognizant of it. Our newspaper first broke this story and continues to cover it closely. Last month, we reported on phone calls made to top Chinese Communist Party leaders asking about organ harvesting. None denied knowledge of the organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners. They just wanted to get on the red line to discuss it. There's been a lot written about whether the Communist Party might collapse in China due to financial problems, corruption, inequality, and so on. What will be the effect of the Communist Party of the publication of the facts about the atrocities of live organ harvesting? We have an instructive example from history. In 1940, Soviet secret police killed over 20,000 Polish officers at Kachin Forest in Russia. Stalin blamed it on the Nazis, and the regime maintained the lie for the next 50 years. In 1989, the truth emerged, and in 1990, Gorbachev admitted what happened. The massacre was also used in the power struggle between Yeltsin and Gorbachev. It strengthened the Polish resistance and crushed the moral authority of the remaining Soviet hardliners. Once something like this is unveiled, there's no going back. The same will be true for China, and the enormous crime of organ harvesting will come to define the Chinese Communist Party. Let's go back to the plot planned by Bo and Zhou. Last month, Bo was stripped of all his party posts. He's been purged and is under investigation. The removal of Bo is a crippling blow to the faction that Jiang formed to persecute Falun Gong. Without Bo to take Zhou's powerful positions in the Standing Committee and as the head of the PLAC, this alternative power structure built to protect Jiang and his faction has basically collapsed. The future of China is now open in a way that has not been the case for a long time. This brings me to the fourth and final point. The United States doesn't need to fear the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. Just as Jiang feared for his legacy, so too do Premier Wen Jiabao and party head Hu Jintao. Wen and Hu are scheduled to retire at the 18th Party Congress, which will most likely be in October. If they don't end the persecution of Falun Gong, they'll be forever tarred as having been complicit in it. But ending the persecution requires Hu and Wen take on the strength of the second power created by Jiang. Western countries raising Falun Gong can strengthen the hands of Hu and Wen as they fight against the rearguard actions of Jiang's faction. The US government cable made available by WikiLeaks supports this, showing that Bo Xilai may have been kept out of the vice premiership position he was vying for in 2007 precisely because of the Falun Gong lawsuits he faced overseas. Of course, if Hu and Wen end the persecution and the crimes done against Falun Gong and others are acknowledged, the Communist Party may likely end as well. There's been much written about the need for the CCP to provide stability in China. It's a big subject that I can't do justice to today, but consider the following. In several speeches, Wen Jiabao has said that the government in China should be independent of the Communist Party. This is heresy for those who believe that the Communist Party should rule China. The party can only rule if it has a monopoly of power. When Qiao Shi was head of the National People's Congress in the late 1990s, he used to say that the party should be subject to the laws of China. If Wen Jiabao and Qiao Shi can speak composedly about a China in which the Communist Party does not have power over everything, we should not be afraid of the same prospect. Since this crisis began, the traffic on the Epoch Times Chinese language website has seen a significant jump and now gets 6 million page views a day. I believe the Chinese people are now flocking to our website, not only because we provide a rare, uncensored look at China in the Chinese language, but also because of the insight we provide that makes sense of what's unfolding there today. We're able to offer that insight because we understand what I've outlined here. The crisis in China turns on the evil of persecuting Falun Gong, and its resolution depends on the stance taken toward that evil.
Thank you, Matt. Dr. Damon Noto is a physician at the Hackensack University Medical Center in New Jersey. I am sure Damon would have been content to continue in his private life as a physician with an active practice, a busy practice, except for one development, and that was the reports of forced live organ harvesting being carried out by doctors in China. Damon was one of the first doctors to join a new organization formed to oppose this atrocity, the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, and he became the organization's spokesperson. He is here today to speak on the topic, Doctors Seek Integrity in Dealing with China. Damon?
I'm a little bit humbled because this topic about forced organ harvesting in China, one of the main people who investigated it and put out the first book, sitting right next to me, David Kilgore. So it gives me honor to sit next to him and talk about this topic. I'd like to tell you about my personal experience with this topic as a medical professional here in the United States and give you the perspective of the medical community. When this organization, Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, began, it was an organization that started looking at the transplant situation around the world and looking for any unethical practices at the time. And over the past several years, the focus of this organization has been China, and there's many good reasons for that. I'd like to give you guys a brief overview about what we've learned about China and how this situation developed. I don't know what your level of knowledge about this is, but I'm going to go back to the beginning. Very early on in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s, we began having evidence that something unethical was going on in China's transplant industry. And in 2001, a famous transplant surgeon from China came and actually attested in front of a congressional hearing that the source of organs for China's transplant community was coming from executed prisoners. At the time, the communist government vehemently denied that that was truthful. Then, after that, we began getting more and more evidence that something very shady was going on. The amount of organs being transplanted in China from 2001 to 2008 just exploded. In the 1990s, they were doing probably a few hundred transplants a year. And by the year 2008, they were doing up to 10,000 transplants a year. To put that in perspective, China today now transplants the second amount most organs every year, behind only us, the United States, compared to a country like the UK, where they're only doing 2,000 to 3,000. The explosion was tremendous. And not only that, the amount of transplant centers in China just literally exploded. From 1999, they had about 150 transplant centers that we documented. And by 2007, they had over 600. The explosion in transplantation literally took doctors really by storm. So we became alarmed. Then another thing happened, which made physicians even more fearful about what was going on. And it was that it appeared China had an overabundance of organs, while the rest of the world, we were struggling to find organs for patients. China began to advertise through medical tourism that you could come to China and within weeks get an organ transplanted. And they weren't just talking about kidneys, they were talking about hearts and livers, which traditionally are tremendously difficult to find. one physician, very famous transplant physician from Israel, he's a heart surgeon. He gave the story that he had a patient that was waiting for a heart transplant for over a year. And that patient one day came to him and said, you know what, I'm frustrated with the situation, and I contacted a hospital in China, and they told me in 2 weeks, I get the organ transplanted, I come back, and it'll be done. And the surgeon was shocked. He had never heard of this. And he said, okay. And in fact, that patient actually did go to China and got the transplantation performed exactly on the day he was told it was going to take place. And he came back and he told the physician everything went perfectly and smoothly, just as they said. This became tremendously troubling for physicians. How is it that the rest of the world was struggling to find organs when China seemed to have an overabundance? In the United States, a kidney, the average time is definitely over a year. It's usually over a year and a half to 2 years before you can find a kidney. Forget about hearts or livers. Secondly, it became very obvious to physicians that this was an extremely profitable business, and that some of the hospitals in China were stating on their own websites that their number one source of revenue was coming from organ transplantation. You can imagine that if you have someone that is killed for their organs and you sell all their organs, the amount of money made off of each person is well over $100,000. So the amount of money and the profitability of this became very, very concerning. So physicians started to say, well, does this make sense? And a lot of people would say, you know, China has the largest population in the world. Why wouldn't it make sense that they transplant the second most amount of transplantations in the world? The big problem we had was China officially had no public organ donation program. It just didn't exist. They had their own Red Cross trying to form a public organ transplantation system, and it failed miserably. And they quoted that only 3 people in Beijing had stepped forward to donate organs in a 20-year time frame. And only 37 people nationwide had registered to become organ donors over a 6-year time frame. And there's many reasons why they have no public organ transplant program, the major one being a cultural reason. Chinese people really believe that they should be buried alive with all their organs. So without a formal public organ transplant program, and even more importantly, without a distribution program, how was it that they were able to transplant 10,000 patients a year? Well, given from their own numbers, I like to use China's own numbers, the Minister of Health, Huang Jiefu, has been quoted several times recently. And the latest quote back in, well, not the latest, but one of the most significant quotes was that in 2005, he reported that 95% of organs transplanted in China comes from executed prisoners. That's from China's own admission. China is still the only country in the world that officially allows the practice of organ harvesting from prisoners. And in this year, 2012, he stated that this practice is going to continue for the next 5 years. So when we looked at these numbers, one of the things we became concerned about was, yes, China's admitting that they're executing prisoners for their organs, and they're doing it on a mass scale. But the bigger problem for physicians was that the numbers didn't add up. So if you look at how many people China executes each year, there's no official number, but by most experts, they say between 2,000 to 8,000 a year. Well, they were transplanting 10,000 people a year. So these numbers simply just didn't match. And furthermore, I'm going to speak just loudly. If they don't match, or let's say they did execute 10,000 people each year, and that they were transplanting 10,000 people each year. The problem is there's just no way you can have an exact match of those 10,000 people with the 10,000 people needing an organ. For instance, in the United States, it's about a 15-to-1 ratio, maybe even a 20-to-1 ratio of people you need to find a match for yourself. So if these numbers hold true in China, they would need a pool of over 150,000 people to be able to transplant 10,000 people. These numbers just became very difficult for the medical community to accept. We just didn't understand it. If you look at blood matching, tissue matching, the fact that these patients need to be disease-free, and we know China has a very high rate of hepatitis B, which would automatically eliminate you. You can't be a donor. We also know that prison population in China usually has a higher rate of hepatitis B than the general. So the numbers didn't add up. So people started to investigate, like one of my friends here, David Kilgore. People started to investigate where are these organs coming from. And through this book, which I'd like to introduce today, State Organs, we now have tremendous amount of evidence that the majority of organs being transplanted into today come from prisoners of conscience. The problem that we have in China is when people are committed to execution, when you're found guilty of committing a crime, China's law is that you must be executed within 7 days. 7 days. There's no time frame where these people are sitting around on death row waiting there. So if you're found guilty, you're executed within 7 days. Once you're executed and those organs, you can't freeze these organs and save them somewhere. You only have a day or two to transplant them. So these organs are not just sitting around. So the time frame, the numbers, all these things became just tremendously concerning for us. This book has not only evidence that prisoners of conscience are being used, but it has evidence from physicians around the world's experience interacting with this system in China today. It talks about this famous physician from Israel and how he had patients going to China and coming back. And he actually implemented a new law in Israel that bans any insurance companies from paying for people going to China to get their organs harvested, to get organs transplanted. So the second thing that we found was that the largest population where we believe these organs are coming from is Falun Gong practitioners, as my previous speaker came from. And the reason many physicians believed that was, one, was that the time frame where there was an escalation in organs being transplanted correlated perfectly with the onset of the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners and the height of the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners. And secondly, they make up the largest group of prisoners of conscience. Have we documented evidence of other groups, the Uyghurs, Tibetans being killed for their organs? Yes. But we believe by far the greatest group is from Falun Gong practitioners. So now the medical community in the United States is faced with a dilemma. We need to understand how to handle this situation. Every day you have people asking medical doctors, should I go to China to get my organs? Every day universities and hospitals in America are faced with the question, should we be training the transplant physicians coming from China? Should we be doing collaborative research with hospitals in China on organ transplantation? We have pharmaceutical companies here in the United States not only doing clinical trials on new drugs to come out for transplantation in China, but they're also supplying the drugs to do these transplantations in China. So we need to know, as a medical profession, every amount of information that's out there to make an informed decision. Otherwise, we're complicit. We're part of this problem. You know, the speaker prior to me mentioned this case of Wang Lijun, and he came to the US Embassy possibly to seek asylum. We know that this guy, by his own self-admission, was involved in thousands of these forced organ transplantations. And he was even given an award in China for his role in forced organ transplantation. We know he met with officials, and we've asked for those official transcripts to see if there's any more evidence that we have that can document what's going on in China so we can make an informed decision. We're asking our representatives in government, we're asking them, please help us get as much information as we can so we can make these decisions. Right now we have physicians fighting in medical journals to ban the use of research that comes out of China so it can't be published. But we don't have as much evidence as we would like to have to say definitively, we need to stop this. So any evidence we can get from the State Department, we would just gladly, we would cherish. I'm going to finish by saying, a lot of times I've given talks around the country and even in other countries about this situation. I feel I failed to give the audience the gravity of this situation, the enormity of the situation. And many physicians feel we only know the tip of the iceberg, and that when all the evidence is released, we're going to be overwhelmed, really, with what's going on in China today. So I hope that through my talk today, you get a better understanding of the situation and the real seriousness of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Damon. When I'm editing a story on China, find something about the Chinese Communist Party I don't understand. I know that there's one source I can go to who, if anyone can make sense of this notoriously closed organization. Yi-Yang Xia is Senior Director of Policy and Research with the Washington, D.C.-based Human Rights Law Foundation. Mr. Xia is an expert on Chinese politics and the structure and functioning of the Chinese propaganda and judicial systems. He's presented his research and analysis at the European Parliament, United Nations Human Rights Commission, and academic institutions here in the United States and in Southeast Asia. Today he'll speak on how maintaining stability undermines stability in China.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Let me start with a story everybody knows. When U.S. delegation went to China to discuss the fate of the blind lawyer Chen Guangcheng, everything went smoothly. And Chen Guangcheng decided to stay in China and enter the universities to study law. And everybody's happy. And when he left the U.S. embassy, something happened. And he changed his mind. That not only surprised the United States, but also surprised the Chinese government. So something must happen. It's not only his friend's call. He himself felt the danger of his life. He's afraid of his life and his family's life. So he changed his mind. What happened? So we can, from the other source, we can see what happened during that time is the U.S. delegation actually discussed with the former Chinese delegation, that's the foreign minister, people from Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But they knew the foreign affairs is weak. They must find somebody can make the decision stronger. So they talked to the secret police. And the secret police is the problem to make the trouble for Chen Guangcheng issue. They have the conflict interest. They cannot get involved in the discussion. Even though the secret police cannot make the decision of Chen Guangcheng, the discussion, they cannot make the decision, but they knew every step the government, they knew every step that Chen Guangcheng is going to go through. So once Chen Guangcheng left the embassy, they knew exactly when and where to strike. If you go through the whole issue, and the secret police, who is behind it? That's the PLC. There's a political and legal affairs committee. That's belongs to the Chinese Communist Party. It's not government body. So actually, when you don't know who you are dealing with, that will be the trouble. Actually, why it's also surprised the Chinese government because the decision was made by the Chinese leadership. But at that time, actually, there's a second power center in China. That's the PLC, represents the police force, the security force. So we need to discuss how this organization, this second power center formed and how it works in current China. First is current years, actually, the Chinese reform, China model hit the wall. Everybody knows, especially the Chinese leaders. When something hit the wall, you have to either turn left or right. So In the ideologically, they turned two directions. One is represented by Bo Xilai, that's singing the revolution, singing the revolutionary song and hit the black, fighting the criminals with the illegal measures. That's what Bo Xilai did. And then another turn is made by Wen Jiabao, try to get some political reform in China, but that didn't go well. Either way, so Bo Xilai's model collapsed, and Wen Jiabao's model has never started. This is one part. Another part is the social turmoil. The social turmoil is the one we need to discuss. How the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, form the mechanism to handle this social turmoil. For the past 30 years, economic reform actually at the cost of human rights, environment, and natural resources. They cannot continue. And that makes the social conflict becomes very hot. So the Chinese Communist Party come out to the resolution is called maintaining stability. That's the way to solve the social turmoil. Wang Lijun, Bo Xilai, actually, they initiated this so-called Hit the Black campaign. And the Bo Xilai, Zhou Yongkang conspiracy is also and Chen Guangcheng's escaping, and recently Shifang protest of the environment last month, the protest, they all point to the same direction. That's the PLC. That's the maintaining stability was managed by this PLC. The concept of maintaining stability was first introduced in 1990s. However, since it was not a priority for CCP leaders at the time, there was no formal structure to implement it, and it received little attention from observers either at home or abroad. This changed in the run-up of the Beijing Olympics in August 2008. Early that year, amidst rising social unrest and fear that the sign of turbulence would surface while the country was in the international spotlight, the CCP rulers felt it necessary to set up a leadership team to prevent such an occurrence. Since 1950s, the CCP has used such a leadership team to coordinate actions on various issues, including the Cultural Revolution. The newly established team was called the CCP Central Committee's Leadership Team for Maintaining Stability. And the head of PLAC, Zhou Yongkang, was appointed to head this new leadership team. As is typical for such team, an office under the leadership group was set up to handle daily tasks. It was called Office for Maintaining Stability. Liu Jun, the then Vice Minister of Public Security, was appointed to direct it. The new leadership team and office immediate task was the maintaining stability before and during the Olympics. But in practice, after Olympics, the same measure continues. So it is called normalization of Olympic security. It means even after the Olympics, the security measures used during Olympics would become the routine practice. There are different departments and committees inside the Chinese Communist leadership. There are 4 departments permanent, and 5 to 6 different committees and leadership teams, and 4 of them involved in the maintaining stability and was headed by Zhou Yongkang. That's why Zhou Yongkang's power, even though he is the last one in the standing committee of the political bureau, but he's the most powerful man because most of the committee and leadership team was headed by him. One person controlled 4 committees. And one of them, okay, this mechanism is very strange to even Chinese. It's a positive feedback system. Usually in China, if somebody in charge a field and this caused a problem, then he will be demoted or at least stop promotion. But for the maintaining stability, once you have a problem, you get more money, you get more power. if there's a conflict between the people and the local government, you need manpower to crack down, suppress. You need money. So they get stronger and stronger once the social turmoil become bigger. So they benefit from the social unrest, not social stability. Chen Guangcheng is a very good example. When Chen Guangcheng was first put in jail because he had conflict defending with the government, defending those women, was forced abortion. And that's routine job in everywhere. But once he was released from prison, he was immediately put at home, and they convert his home as a new prison. And this caused the problem. They need money to convert the whole village as a part of the prison. And they need money, they need manpower, so they ask for it. Since this whole process was under the name of the maintaining stability, and then more money we invest into it. According to Chen Guangcheng, in 2008, it's about 4.7 million US dollars used on himself, one person. 3 years later, this number doubled. So it's 9.4 million US dollars to monitor one person. So they get more and more money as the reward of doing bad job to maintaining stability. So the maintaining stability, since it started, more and more conflict, social turmoil become the problem, and the outsiders can see all the changes. And this year is the second year the maintaining stability budget. It's called the public security budget. Budget is more than military spending. This is the second year. So this is never happened before. And that's why the Zhou Yongkang and his power become even danger the CCP's rule. This is a Chen Guangcheng issue. And the two other cases I can give you example. One example is the 610 office. The 610 office was established in 1990, in June 10th, 1999, was established to persecute Falun Gong. And once it's established, the persecution is their best interest. So as long as the persecution continues, they will get the manpower and the budget. And this office has the power to carry out the persecution, to collect the information, to give the suggestions for the policymakers. So all in one. So they always make the issue bigger, and they always make the issue need to continue. So the policymakers are getting the information from this organization who carry out the persecution. This is the 610 office. And also, the maintaining stability actually is originated from the 610 office. So people get confused, said that they changed the name. Actually, they didn't change the name. Just the target, the 610 office target is Falun Gong practitioners, and the maintaining stability office target is wide to everybody. But their head are the same. The maintaining stability and the persecution of Falun Gong, the leadership team, the same person, Zhou Yongkang. The first office director, Liu Jing, same person. So people confused, thought this is the same office, but actually they are not. They are separate. But you can see the mechanism to persecute Falun Gong immediately transfer to persecute to the wide range of the populations. And another example is Tibet. We can see the Tibetan issue getting worse and worse. And people always ask why the Chinese Communist Party won't sit down to talk to Dalai Lama, because Dalai Lama already gave up the independence. And that fits Communist Party's requirement. Why they don't sit down? Because one, the Chinese Communist Party need an enemy, always need an enemy somewhere. So if there's no one, they will create one. The second one is there's an interest group formed against the Tibetan independence. The officials who worked in Tibet, has ever worked in Tibet, all the scholars, all the security force who involved in the Tibetan issue, they have You know, they have carried out the persecution for so many years, and they create a series and they create policies to continue to make this Tibetan independence a big issue. As long as this is a big issue, they have all the interest to gain. So there's no way. So anything concerned social stability will be this very strange feedback. It will never stop. It will getting worse and worse. Okay, I think. So the political turmoil is only the tip of the iceberg. The maintaining stability policy is based on the fact that China economic development is at the cost of human rights, the environment, and the natural resources. Any model, Chongqing model actually, it is China model. Chongqing model or China model won't last long if it is based on that. Try not to bend our value and principles is our best interest. Because if we bend to their interest, there's no our interest at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Young. Okay, now let's open the floor.
I don't think the government should engage in that. It's as I said, that there are many like-minded people inside China who needs the encouragement.